50% of the heads of the top businesses in South Korea have been found guilty of criminal offenses. And yet each of them has received a presidential pardon, frequently without spending time in jail. South Korea is facing a pandemic of business leaders that are frequently evading justice for white-collar crimes. And today, we'll learn the circumstances that allowed South Korea's reign of faultless elites. From One Up Media, this is Empires. Let's first do a rundown of some of the criminals that have rocked South Korea. First on the list, the nut rage heiress. On December 5, 2014, Heather Cho, the Korean Airlines heiress and vice president, was unhappy with her nuts being served in a bag rather than on a plate. Even though it was standard procedure, Heather exploded into rage, then assaulted the cabin crew before demanding that the plane return to the gate. Her fiasco led to a 20-minute flight delay. Both Heather and Korean Air faced public backlash, and the Korean courts found her guilty of obstructing aviation safety, where she was sentenced to 12 months in prison. She was out after serving just 5 months and placed on 2 years probation. Her case was the first that truly impacted foreigners and showed people around the world that it isn't the CEO that rules the company. It's the dynastic family that founded the company. Besides the nut rage heiress, 3 other high-profile business leaders have also been found guilty of fraud. Cho Yang-ho, the father of Heather Cho, was caught for tax evasion in 2000. Chung Mong-koo of Hyundai Motors and Lee Kun-hee of the Samsung Group were caught for tax evasion in 2008. All 3 were sentenced to 3 years in jail, which is commonly agreed as too light a punishment. And yet these sentences were commuted to 5 years probation. This became known as the 3-5 rule, where no matter the crime, a faultless elite is often given a 3-year prison sentence, followed by a suspension for 5 years. These faultless elites are from a class of businesses called Chaebols. The Chaebols translate to wealth groups, and the top 3 are Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. These companies are influential, dynastic, and have been very controversial throughout South Korea's history. A Chaebol structure was inspired by both pre- and post-war Japanese companies. Pre-war Japanese companies were dynastic, and often power was isolated to a single family. Whereas post-war, the Allied forces restructured these companies to the keiretsus. The more famous ones are Mitsubishi and the Sumitomo Group. The keiretsu is a type of Japanese company structure that consists of many business units revolving around the financing of a bank. These companies would own shares of each other, deal with each other, and continue expanding with the aid of bank leverage. Because Korea was under Japanese oppression, founders of Samsung, Hyundai, and LG had observed how Japan ran businesses and modeled the Chaebols after a keiretsu, but allowed total control in a single family, as if in pre-war Japan. The results were wealth groups that exhibited too much power, amassing wealth and creating a huge income disparity in the early 1960s. Why were there historical ties between politics and business in South Korea? On May 16, 1961, a military general by the name of Park Chun-hee had revolted against the current administration and took over as president. The Park family were educated but poor, a profound experience that made General Park disdain mediocrity. He grew up admiring Napoleon, eventually joining the Japanese Imperial Army when Korea was still under occupation. He served them well, rose to lieutenant, and was stationed in Manchuria, where he observed the trading influence that the pre-war Japanese businesses had. In his opinion, their excessive aggregation of wealth had hurt national interests, and yet they were undeniably capable of driving development. After the war, his expertise was pivotal in growing Korea's military might, and by 1958, he was made general. Throughout his ascent, he had observed then-President Ri award contracts on relationships and create a corrupt society that birthed the Chaebols. With the same disdain and disgust, he gathered his forces and took control of the government, then shifted his attention to the business tycoons. General Park reshaped the Chaebol structure by removing the bank that finances them. By stripping Chaebols of any ready financial supply, they would depend on the government for lifelines, which were only given if they hit manufacturing quotas. If any business fell behind, he would pull out state funding and force the Chaebol to flirt with the prospects of bankruptcy. His expert command of these business empires became a trigger point in history that was dubbed the Miracle on the Han River, a period of growth that raised South Korea's GDP per capita by over 200 times from 1960 to today. A huge reason behind the growth was a pivot towards exports that forced Chaebols to sell outwards and bring funding inwards. It also turned its people into the nation's comparative advantage by investing heavily in skills, education, and knowledge. Under President Park's leadership, he would inextricably link the Chaebol success with South Korea, forcing them to bring the economy up as they grew. In return, he would also enact policies that protected South Korean businesses, which is why, despite how globalized Korea might seem, almost all the main providers tend to be Korean companies. His era created a political entanglement between the government and the Chaebols, which would create precedent for future kingpins to come. In 1966, a first-of-its-kind fertilizer plant was built using government funding by Samsung. It had a target production of 330,000 tons, but somehow kept falling short. Eventually, through investigations, it was revealed that the son of Samsung's founder had sold chemicals meant for fertilizers to a saccharin processing plant. Saccharin is a type of artificial sweetener. Because South Korea was still in a precarious economic situation, President Park used the sentencing to force Samsung founder to surrender control of the fertilizer plant to the government. This would be one of the many economical negotiations that President Park's regime brought, whereby white-collar criminals could have reduced sentences as long as they served the state's economy. How has the relationship between politics and business evolved? Since Park Chung-hee's assassination in 1979, the rules of the game have changed dramatically. Years of state support had made the South Koreans' Chaebols into South Korea's economic pillars. But it had also given them autonomy. Because the Chaebols had grown large enough to survive without state funding, the state had less leverage over them. Instead, many of the Chaebols had begun providing financial support during political campaigns, naturally favoring those that favored them. In the 1980s to 1990s, President Chun Do-hwan and President Roh Tae-woo had accepted funds from Chaebol leaders in the form of political donations. In the early 2000s, President Roh Moo-hyun attempted suicide when investigations of a $6 million bribe were underway. Then in the 2010s, it intensified with President Lee Myung-bak being accused of receiving bribes that totaled over $33 million and President Park Geun-hye, who famously worked with a third-generation Samsung leader, Lee Jae-yong. Prior to her conviction, President Park had made questionable decisions, issuing 6,500 pardons that included a whole group of Chaebol leaders. Given that she had come into power promising reform, the move seemed ludicrous, if not for what she was about to do next. At that time, Samsung was undergoing a power struggle. In order to transfer ownership of the company to Lee, they needed support from a web of shareholders that was linked to President Park. By donating $36 million to President Park's longtime confidant, they managed to get the deal approved. Naturally, when this was discovered, it led to a massive scandal. As a result, both President Park and Lee Jae-yong were heavily criticized and convicted. But today, both have been pardoned, and Lee Jae-yong is now chairman of the Samsung Group. What are the present reasons why they still escape serving jail terms? Officially, Chaebol leaders are granted pardons for their economic contribution to the state. This is not completely far-fetched, given that under the government's watch, the Chaebols had turned South Korea into one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. But the line started blurring when Chaebols were forgiven for things beyond just fraudulent activities. Most noticeably, the semiconductor leukemia incident. In October 2005, a young lady by the name of Hwang Yu-mi had suffered from acute myeloid leukemia. Over time, she had sought treatment before relapsing in January 2007. 3 months later, she died. At the time, Yumi had worked in Samsung Electronics' semiconductor division and repeatedly dipped electrical components in a chemical bath, prolonged exposure had caused the leukemia to form. Shortly after, many cases were reported, and a group consisting of the parents and lawyers had begun fighting the case against Samsung. It took 11 years before Samsung Electronics finally agreed to settle, during which time they had bullied the complainants and falsified information regarding the victims' work in Samsung. The incident highlighted the extent of Samsung's control over government personnel, police, and organizations who accepted Samsung donations, but also the swaying power they have over media outlets. In 1965, Samsung's founder had established the Central Times, a Korean news outlet modeled after Japan's daily papers. Today, it is one of the largest news outlets and part of the Big Three. The Central Times' largest advertiser is Samsung, and with its founding history is assumed to be the tongue of Samsung, giving them a voice whenever needed. A combination of bullying, media control, and donations have made this battle considerably long drawn, but more importantly, traumatic to the families of the victims. Would the $11.6 million settlement Samsung had agreed to be enough? Reasons of simple economic contribution don't seem to capture the nuances behind the verdicts, and it's likely that a variety of complementary reasons contribute. Besides repaying political debt, another could be for judges to secure the exit options in their career. It's an open secret that the most successful authorities are often courted by the Chaebols to join their legal teams, and it's assumed that these positions come with lucrative payouts. Some of these Chaebols would reportedly court them for years. If the government sector cannot promise ambitious attorneys promotion and financial compensation, then they might want to secure their exit elsewhere. Naturally, among the richest in South Korea. This may extend to the common people across all sectors who want to gain as much favor as they can with their future employers. You may be quick to think that this is a sellout's mentality, but in South Korea, finding a job is a significant challenge. South Korea is ranked 4th in the world in the percentage of tertiary graduates. But for these educated students, the country's employment rate is ranked 31st among 37 countries. Essentially, the number of jobs which match the right education level aren't opening up, leading to an influx of highly educated youths who often have to settle for less or go jobless. Faced with these challenges, what would you do? By the way, if you want to know more about the dynastic rise of Samsung, then you might want to check out our podcast, Empires. In each episode, we take you on an epic audio journey, exploring the innovations, collusions, and the consumer electronic war of the Samsung Group, starting in 1938, when Samsung was just a vegetable and dried fish shop in Daegu City. But wait, there's more. We've an extensive catalog where we unravel the rise of industry giants like Sony and the transformation of unicorns like Tencent into unstoppable monopolies. All right, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I hope we've left you with something to take back from the video. Till the next one. From One Up Media, this is Empires.